مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. هل يكرهوننا؟ هل يحبوننا؟ هل يشكل ذلك أي فرق؟ هل من المفترض أن نختم؟ هل أمريكا الأمة التي لا يمكن الاستغناء عنها؟ هل نحن المدينة المشرفة على التل؟ أم أن شعارنا ينبغي أن يكون أمريكا أولاً؟ هل يراقب العالم ما نقوله أو ما نفعله؟ حين يفوز رجل من خارج الساحة السياسية ولم يخدم قط في الحكومة بانتخاباتنا القومية، هل ذاك سبب لاختفاء بديمقراطياتنا أم سبب للخوف من تدهور ديمقراطياتنا؟ ما رأي الناس حول العالم في هذا السؤال؟ لمناقشة قضية أساسية ترتبط بعلاقات أمريكا بالعالم من حولنا، يسرني أن أرحب بخبير بالرأي العام العالمي والسياسة الخارجية الأمريكية من مركز بيو للأبحاث، وهو بروس ستوكس. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. President Trump has been both an engine of and mirror of a trend of populism, not just in America, of course, but around the world. So today we're going to talk about this relationship between populism around the world, here in the United States, and larger global themes that might impact on American foreign policy. And our guest today is Bruce Stokes of Pew Research. Thank you very much for joining us.
Great to be with you.
So America first has a certain resonance in the United States, but we're not the only country that has this us first approach. How powerful is this populist nationalist theme when you look at some of America's traditional allies?
Well, it's certainly powerful, as you mentioned, in the U.S. In our surveys before the election, by about 2 to 1, Americans said they thought the United States was not as powerful today as it was 10 years ago. So there was this yearning for a yesteryear, America that was more powerful in people's memory than it is today. And when we asked that same question in Europe, we found that other than the Germans, who basically said actually we're more powerful now than we were before, which is probably, by many measures true, there were a number of countries where people said, no, we aren't the country we once were. So there is this kind of sense of belief that somehow we're in decline, which I think feeds into a populist message of, well, someone should fix this, that we should go back to where we were. And then that feeds into other issues of nationalism and nativism, concern about the other or fear of the other, which then also feeds the populist, nationalist, nativist tendencies in a lot of politics on both sides of the Atlantic, certainly.
And where would you say is this sense felt the strongest?
Well, when we did an analysis in Europe, for example, what we found that the most nativist countries were in Central and Southeastern Europe. So it was Poland, Hungary, Greece, to a certain extent Italy. Now we didn't survey in all countries, so I can't talk about Romania or Bulgaria or whatever. But what was interesting, it was those countries that either had suffered most from the Euro crisis, or were new to kind of Western traditions and values, were new entrants into the EU, and maybe had a different historical background.
Interesting. And the countries that had the least of this populist message in their politics?
Well, what was interesting, in terms of the public opinion sentiment, you could identify Sweden, Germany, despite the turmoil in German politics about the refugee situation, the Netherlands to a certain extent. Now, what's interesting is that, nevertheless, in each of those countries, there is a rising populist political movement. In Sweden, it's the Swedish Democrats, who are, I think, the third largest party in the country. In the Netherlands, it's the PVV and the Wilders Party, which came in second, basically. It tied for second in the most recent election in the Netherlands. You have the AfD in Germany, the alternative for Deutschland, which is small, but is polling better than it ever had before. And all of these parties share, to a certain degree or another, a skepticism about the EU, anti-immigrant or anti-refugee or anti-Muslim set of beliefs. And what's also interesting, and I think is underappreciated, is there's a belief put forward by all of these parties that direct democracy is what we want, not representative democracy. So there's a broader sense of skepticism about institutions that people believe have failed them. And one of those is representative democracy. And so in the platforms of each of these parties, there is a demand for more referenda. And that, I think, is one of the trends, the populist trends per se, especially in Europe, that needs to be watched, because it would transform the way we govern societies and potentially would give greater power to populist forces, because we know that referenda can have a life of their own and can often pass for reasons that people didn't anticipate.
You're referring specifically, Exhibit A would be the British vote to leave the European Union.
Exhibit A would be the British vote to leave the European Union, which basically the polls thought would probably not pass. Exhibit B would be in the Netherlands. There was there's a rule in the Netherlands that if you can get a certain number of members of the public to sign a petition, you can then have a referenda on it. And they had a referenda on a free trade agreement with the Ukraine, which is not generally the kinds of things that you have a referenda on, and they were able to block that. So, I mean, there are at least precedents here that would suggest that these referenda could have broad impacts. And we shouldn't ignore the fact that in Iceland, way over on the edge of Europe, the second most popular party is the Pirate Party.
Pirate?
Pirate, that's an interesting name. They have in their party agenda that every government decision should be voted on the internet. Not just major decisions or things we bring up, but everything. So there is a desire here for people to have more direct influence on legislation and initiatives in the country. The technology now exists to do that in ways that didn't exist before, and there is this disillusionment in our surveys and Eurobarometer surveys and others with the institutions that had traditionally been the institutions of representative democracy.
In which the anti-immigrant party, which some people thought might come out ahead, did not. And a center-right party, a pro-Europe party, won. Has the populist trend peaked in Europe, or is this just a moment of centrism?
Well, we can't really judge if it's peaked. I mean, we'll be able to say 5 years from now whether it's peaked. But our surveys show, for example, that people who are supporters of the anti-immigrant party in the Netherlands, or people who are supporters of the National Front, which is the anti-immigrant party, the main anti-immigrant party in France, their views on a range of issues, whether it's how they view the EU or how they view refugees and immigrants or how they view Muslims or whatever, are significantly different from the views of the general population. So they are, they hold the views that their affiliation to that party would suggest they might. And they're more worried about the country's future. They're more worried about, in fact, we found when we did an analysis in our surveys in 2016, that the most important driving factor behind support for these populist parties was not concern about the economy, which one might have expected. The Europeans have had a very bad economy for a long time. It wasn't anti-EU sentiment, although these people didn't very much like the EU. It was anti-immigrant sentiment. It was anti-refugee sentiment. It was anti-Muslim sentiment. It was very much focused on those issues. But I think we have seen in the Dutch election, for example, that even though the anti-immigrant party didn't win, it did gain about 5 seats. It didn't maybe do as well as some people had feared, but it did better than it has in the past. I do think these things still bear watching as we go forward in terms of whether populism has peaked yet or not. I think it's hard to say, even if it doesn't prevail.
Okay, when we come back, we're going to discuss whether Europe shares some of the same phobias that American institutions are suffering from. Problems regarding the media, the institutions of Congress, Parliament, and our overall political system in just a moment. Our guest today is Bruce Stokes. Bruce is Director of Global Economic Attitudes at Pew Research Center, one of the world's leading monitors of public opinion. At Pew, Bruce is responsible for assessing public views about economic conditions, foreign policy, and values. He is also a fellow at the German Marshall Fund and associate fellow at London's Chatham House. Previously, he served as the international economics correspondent for the National Journal and as a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. A frequent media commentator on major news outlets like CNN, BBC, and National Public Radio, Bruce is a graduate of Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service and Johns Hopkins University's School for Advanced International Studies. So before we turn to questions about institutions, I did want to ask this. Anti-immigrant parties could lead one into a number of different foreign policy directions. One would be to say, well, we don't want more immigrants, so let's help solve the problems of those countries there so the immigrants don't have to come here. Another is, well, let's just put up a big wall to keep the immigrants from coming in. So when you look at the connection between these views to foreign policy, what general direction do you see Europeans taking on this issue?
Well, we have asked Europeans, do you want your country to deal with its own problems and let other countries deal with their own problems, or should we help other countries deal with their problems? And basically most Europeans say, no, we just should deal with our own problems and let other countries deal with their problems. Now, Americans say the same exact thing. In fact, in our survey, our most recent survey of 13 countries, only the Japanese said, no, we need to help other countries deal with their problems. So it's not at all clear this is a purely isolationist sentiment or it's just a domestic issues first kind of sentiment, but it certainly suggests that people aren't that interested in prioritizing international issues over domestic issues, which again, as you say, could feed into, and certainly we found in our surveys before the US election that people who were supportive of Donald Trump were more likely to say than, say, people who supported Hillary Clinton, we need to deal with our own problems first and let other countries deal with their own problems. So there is that sense of inward lookingness, if not isolationism.
Now, even before Donald Trump, Brexit, et cetera, institutions, certainly in America, have been suffering in the court of public opinion, whether it's Congress or the presidency or the media. So how much has that taken an even bigger hit in the era of Brexit, Trump, et cetera? How much worse off in the public view are these institutions?
You're absolutely right. I mean, we've looked at this extensively. The Gallup organization has looked at this extensively in the U.S. and in other countries. In the U.S., for example, support for government is at a historic low. Then if you look at the institutions of government, Congress, the presidency, the Supreme Court, the Army, et cetera, big business, small business, almost all of these institutions have seen a dramatic drop in their public support. My memory serves me correctly, the support for the U.S. Congress is at about 13% in the U.S. population. We did a survey in Europe and asked about the European Parliament, and it was about 32, 33%. Now, the Europeans were aghast at how low that was, and I said, look, you members of the U.S. Congress would be overjoyed to have that kind of public support.
Are national parliaments viewed better?
Well, we haven't asked that question, but the Eurobarometer has, and they find that there is higher support for national parliaments in Europe than there is for the European Parliament, but it's still fairly low. I can't remember the exact number, but my memory serves me correctly, it's below 50%. So, I mean, one of the challenges I think facing almost all democracies today is that the traditional institutions of these societies, the ones that at least have led the societies for generations, are now almost universally distrusted. Expertise is increasingly distrusted. We find that in some of our surveys in the United States. And so one of the challenges, I think, facing all democracies, and populism then feeds into this challenge, is if we're going to have a public policy debate about a given issue, at least in recent history, it's been institutions and expertise and leaders who've led those public debates. If those institutions and people aren't trusted by the general public, how do you have a debate about this? It doesn't mean you can't, but it's going to require new approaches to these issues to actually have a legitimate public debate about them.
Well, to have a legitimate public debate, you need media. And I want to focus specifically on this question because in America, over the last number of months, the whole concept of fake media, fake news, media as the enemy of the people has emerged in our public debate. Has this been a trend that predated the Trump candidacy? And how broad is this when you look at our partners in Europe?
Well, support for the media has gone down in the United States, but traditional media has lost support in the general public, and it's also because of the diffusion of media, you see a polarization in how media is used. We did a survey in the United States recently, and what was striking was that people who basically had liberal values tended to get a good deal of their information from liberal media sources, National Public Radio, MSNBC, whatever. And people with traditionally conservative views tended to get their news from Fox News. And what's interesting is because of the multiplicity of media sources, people are self-segregating themselves into where they get their information. I saw one survey that was done where 40% of Trump voters said they got most of their news from Fox News. So there is a connection then to politics. So you get your news from a certain source, and that may influence how you vote. Or maybe because you voted that way, you got your news from, but the point being, it's not the America I grew up in where there were 3 television networks, they were all fairly centrist, and there was one central message in the public debate because we all got our news from the same sources.
So that era is gone.
Absolutely. And it's the technology which we can't put that genie back in the box.
We only have about a minute left, so I want to shift gears for a second. After 9/11, September 11th, the question du jour, the big issue was, why do they hate us? First, do they hate us? And second, does that really matter? I mean, how does that translate into anything of policy relevance?
Well, certainly our data showed that actually beginning of the Bush administration, but certainly after the Iraq War, there was a decline in support for the United States almost everywhere. Then support for the United States shot up with the election of Barack Obama. It had actually begun to increase a little bit in Europe and then shot up under Barack Obama. It has, in Europe, it has tailed off a little bit in Europe, but still in every year of the Obama administration, support for the U.S. in Europe was higher than it was in any year of the Bush administration. However, what was interesting is that in the Middle East, in the Muslim majority countries of the Middle East, in our surveys, the support for the U.S. fell under the Bush administration, and it never recovered under Obama. And so the interesting question will be what happens with the new administration? How do attitudes towards the United States change with this new administration? We are currently surveying on this issue. We don't know what's going to happen, but we do know that there was this decline under Bush, this dramatic improvement under Obama, at least in Western Europe, and the question is what happens now. We don't know.
Bruce Stokes of Pew, thank you so much for joining us today on Dakhel, Washington.
Thank you.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول كيف ينظر الناس في بلدكم إلى أمريكا تحت قيادة الرئيس ترامب، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@elhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.